Now, if we look at an ecosystem, we'll see that organisms are interacting with each other all the time. But in fact, the main way that organisms interact with each other is by eating each other. So there's a whole bunch of different consumers. Obviously, producer organisms, things that photosynthesize, trees and grass, well, they don't eat other organisms, but other organisms certainly eat them. So there's a whole range of different types of consumers, organisms, or heterotrophs, organisms that eat other organisms. I'll go through a bit of a list here. So you'll know some of these already. Herbivore, well, that's a consumer which only eats producers or plants. A carnivore, that's an organism and that only eats other animals. An omnivore, that's a type of consumer that eats both plants and animals. A parasite is a consumer and that actually lives on or inside another organism and feeds off it at the expense of the other organism, so it's bad for the organism that it's feeding off. Scavenger is a consumer, and that's a consumer which eats dead organisms. So, a jackal, which is consuming the leftover bones of an animal on the savannah, is a scavenger. A detrivore, an example of a detrivore would be a worm, and detrivores are organisms which eat detritus, and they do it with their mouths. So detritus is the little bits of dead living things that fall to the ground, like dead leaves and dead plant material. So worms go and eat all that and kind of help break it down. Decomposers are similar to detrivores, but decomposers are things like bacteria and funguses, and those organisms, they actually excrete enzymes onto food that's decomposing, and then those enzymes break down the food and then they absorb the products of that breakdown. So they don't eat them with their mouths, they decompose the food that they're sitting on and then they absorb their nutrients. So yeah, the main way that organisms interact with each other is by eating each other. And here's an example of a carnivore, a tiger, eating a herbivore. So this is a deer or something like that. We're obviously omnivores, we eat plants and animals, but eating each other is not the only way that organisms interact with each other. Interspecific competition is another way that organisms interact with each other. So over here I have a picture of a lion, and it's obviously having a fight with some hyenas here, and it's probably, could very well be about some sort of food. So they might be competing. Interspecific means different species are competing for some resource, and they could be competing for food. So the lion and the hyenas, they're interacting with each other in this form of competition. Symbiosis is another way that organisms interact with each other. And there's a few different types of symbiosis, but symbiosis means living together in a close partnership. One type of symbiosis is mutualism, and mutualism is when both of the organisms that are living in close partnership benefit. For example, you've got trillions of bacteria living in our guts, and that's a mutualistic symbiotic relationship because we benefit because the bacteria helps us break down food, and the bacteria benefit because we give it food all the time. Commensalism is when one organism benefits in the relationship and the other is neither harmed nor benefit. So they live together and one of them gets something good out of it, but the other one's just kind of, cruising along. And the last type of symbiotic relationship is parasitism. So that is where one organism is benefiting in the relationship, in that close living partnership, but the other organism is being harmed by it. So symbiosis is when organisms, they're interacting, they're living really in a close partnership, and there's different types depending on who benefits or who doesn't benefit. Another way that organisms interact with each other is an example over here. And so this is a pollinator. So this is an insect like a bee or something, and it is going to get some honey from a flower, and in doing so it's actually collecting some pollen. So here's some pollen here. There's little yellow bits of pollen. It collects some pollen and then it takes that pollen to another flower to fertilize the other flower. That's not symbiosis because they don't always live together, the flowers and the bees, but of course that's another way that organisms interact with each other. So interactions between organisms are many and varied, but of course the main way that organisms interact with each other is as a source of food.